Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop my son off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It's kind of a gloomy Wednesday morning here in suburban Chicago. The air is sort of frosty and misty. The weather is high 30s, but kind of chilly for what it is. And I'm walking home. Looking forward to talking to you. So I have a corrections corner to make. When I did the election episode, I was thinking that I got to vote yesterday, March 10th, and I was wrong. It's March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, that we vote for the primary here in Illinois. So I will be voting that day, not yesterday. Thankfully, I figured that out before I tried to go to the polls. Hopefully none of you mistakenly went to the polls in Illinois because of my mistake. If so, I'd say you should do a little more research on elections, because one guy on a podcast tells you you're voting on the 10th and you go, yikes. That said, I know at least one other person who made that mistake as well, so I wonder if that date got in my head due to a Russian Facebook bot. It's a well-known thing where people intentionally mislead people about the day they vote so as to make them miss the election. Although telling people to vote early doesn't really work there, because if I go to the polls and try to vote and can't because that's early, I haven't missed my opportunity. Anyway, so I thought today, given that I've had a few new games pop up in my wake and I discovered another second mistake. I know it's rare, two mistakes corrected in one episode. A few episodes back, I referred offhandedly to Broom Service and said something like, oh, well, I talked about that. And looking back over my show notes, I don't think I did. I looked at the episode where I did a triple shot after LionCon, and Broom Service was not one of the games I talked about. So I may have mentioned it here and there, but I don't know that I gave it the full shooting from the hip treatment, in which it gets a full third of an episode, 5 or 6 solid minutes of conversation about a game that I've only played once. That's the kind of high quality reviewing you look for here on Pick Up and Deliver today. So today's episode, Shootin' from the Hip, Triple Shot, Carbon City Zero, Broom Service, and Le Havre. So for those of you new to the podcast, Shootin' from the Hip is a segment I do in which I talk about a board game I've played recently. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a review, because I've only played the game once or twice, usually is the rule. If I'm going to do a more elaborate review than that, I try to get up to 6 to 10 plays before I will do a deeper discussion of an episode. So this is Shootin' from the Hip. I'm quick reactions, and I usually do 2 or 3. I usually talk about 2 or 3 games in an episode, hence the triple shot. So with that out of the way, the first game I want to talk about is Carbon City Zero. I had a chance to play this over the weekend. A buddy of mine backed it on Kickstarter and brought the game over for us to try. Carbon City Zero is published by 1010 Climate Action. The designers are Sam Illingworth and Paul Wake, and the artists are Matt Boomer and Tony Pickering. Carbon City Zero is a small box deck building game. You start, as with many deck building games, you start with the same set of cards that all the other players have, and there's a market in a sort of river form that comes out. And on your turn, you play all the cards in your hand. Oh, so one of the big differences is you don't have cards in between turns. A lot of games, you have cards in your hand and stuff can happen to your hand in between your turns. In this game, your hand is empty in between your turns. At the beginning of your turn, you draw and lay out the 5 cards on the table, which is an interesting choice. It means that everybody's watching what everybody does and you all see, but you also can't plan ahead, which isn't my favorite idea because it slows the game down a bit. But you draw your cards and you lay them out, and having done so, you get purchasing points, which is a main part of any deck builder, right? And you can use those purchasing points to buy new buildings to put into your deck, standard stuff. Here's where the twist comes in. At the beginning of the game, everybody's city is at a carbon rating of 40. There's a scoreboard, and you start with essentially 40 points. And your goal is to be the first one to get to 0 points. So you're trying to get down to a carbon rating of 0. And the way it works is when you draw those 5 cards out, some of them have a dark carbon rating. And when a card with a carbon rating comes out, it adds that many carbon to your city's rating. So if you have a card with a carbon rating of 2, at the end of the round, you raise your carbon rating for your city by 2. At the same time, there are buildings you can buy, none of the buildings you start with, but there are buildings you can buy that lower the carbon rating. And of course, you want to get lots of those. It's equivalent to getting points in the game. Of course, as with many games like this, the other thing that the cards you might buy from the row, they do 3 things. They either lower your carbon rating, or they give you money that lets you buy more buildings, or they'll have some sort of special action, like often they will chain off of other cards. If you have another card of this color, then this card, reduces your carbon rating by some percentage more, or for every card of this color, it reduces. There's also cards that will let you draw more cards, and there's cards that will let you thin your deck. Thinning your deck is really important because some of the cards you have you really don't want to keep. That said, there's a nice tension in the game between the cards that give you money and the cards that add carbon. Generally, the cards that produce a lot of money also produce a lot of carbon. These are big factories. There's a number of ways to ameliorate that. There are other cards that say factories in your hand don't produce any carbon this turn. So if you get a couple of those and you get some lucky draws, you could get a bunch of money and no carbon uptake. There's lots of green technologies you can buy. And of course, those green technologies are expensive, so you need money. It's a nice interplay. Component-wise, the game is really nice. They made a big deal in producing the game of having the game be carbon neutral, or I honestly don't know exactly what, or as low impact as possible. It's made out of entirely recycled materials. That means that the cards are a little flimsier than something like your linen coated Fantasy Flight super duper fancy cards. They're probably not triple black platinum core or whatever you get when you get a super fancy game. That said, they're fine, and I'm sure they'll stand up to many plays, and then you could eventually sleeve them if you wanted to keep the game going. Although I'm not sure how the makers of Carbon City Zero would feel about you buying plastic sleeves to put on the game. As opposed to buying a new game, it's probably better. The art is really nice. It's reminiscent of Machi Koro, although each building is just the picture of the building on a blank background of color. I will admit I did not notice if the game had a pattern embedded in the color. So if you have, the game does depend on you being able to tell which kind of building you're buying. I believe there were icons along with the color, but the color was the main index I was using. So if you have color issues, you may want to look at some pictures of the game online to see whether those might be a problem or not. I don't think they would be. I'm pretty sure there were icons for different kinds of buildings, but I can't attest to that fully. Overall, it's a nice little deck builder. I mean, it's not gonna blow your mind or anything. It's pretty standard in the way that it works, but if you've played deck builders before, it's easy enough to pick up, and there's lots of interesting little decisions. One of the things I like quite a bit is one of your standard cards that you get allows you to cycle the market. The market doesn't move on its own. It only refills when someone buys a building, which in some games can be a real problem, right? You get stuck. I've had more than one game where we as a family house ruled the game because the market would get stuck. Miskatonic School for Girls comes to mind. In that game, if the market is stuck, if on your turn you don't buy a card, we let you eliminate a card. That sort of thing. In Carbon City Zero, the way they solve this is a couple of the cards in your deck allow you to trash one of the cards in the market, which then draws a new card to come out. Here's the thing. Whenever you buy a building or do that trashing action, and you're drawing a card, some of the cards that you draw out are just bad events. Some of them are like neutral events that just kind of clog up your hand, but some of them are actively bad. They add carbon, and those go into your deck. If you clear a hole in the market from buying or this action, and then you draw a bad event, it goes into your deck. And then, of course, you refill the market again. That said, you also have enough cards. It's easy enough to get cards that thin your deck that wasn't a real big hindrance. But it is something to be cautious about when you're deciding to cycle the market. Yeah, the art is nice, cute, very functional. Again, not going to blow your socks off, but it's a lovely little game and definitely worth a try if you get an opportunity. And if you care about conversations about environmentalism, this might be a nice way to start thinking about, on a pretty simple level, what it means to do city planning in the context of environmental choices. So that's Carbon City Zero from 1010 Climate Action Publishing. That's published this year. On the opposite end of things, the other two games I want to talk about today are much older. Broom Service, I didn't write down the year, from Andreas Pelikan and Alexander Pfister. I can't read my own handwriting here. It might not be Andreas Pelikan. It's definitely Andreas. I apologize, Andreas, if Pelikan is not your last name. Art by Vincent Dutrait, published by Aaliyah and Ravensburger. Broom Service was nominated and maybe won the Spiel des Jahres. It is a family weight game, action selection. Its neat mechanism, or its unique mechanism, is everybody has a deck of cards with specific roles on them, and you choose which role you want to activate. And when it's your turn, you have to declare, are you doing the cowardly or the brave version of that role? If you do the cowardly, you get a minor reward, but you get it for sure, and you get it right away. If you do the brave action, you're going to get more stuff, and it's enough that you want to do that if you can. But anybody else who's left in the round who has also picked that role, and you didn't realize they had picked it, then they reveal that role, and they too can declare that they're going to do the brave action, and then you get nothing because they've taken over being brave. So if you're later in the turn order, you can declare brave more safely, or if you can tell that the other person has not declared that role. Because the way it works is you pick, of the 7 roles you can pick, you choose, I think, 3 that you're going to do that round, or 4. So I think it's 3. Like if I picked the herbalist role, if someone else as their lead plays the herbalist role, then I have to play it. Like I can't wait and play it later. You play it at the same time as everyone else who's played it. So it's an interesting little push your luck mechanism. In the game, you're moving. The theme is that you're delivering potions. You're these witches delivering potions. The guy who's teaching it to me described it as Kiki's Delivery Service, the board game, which is, I think, apt. As you're doing those deliveries, you are gathering new potions. You're competing for control of these castles that give you points, and then capturing storm clouds, which give you points. So it's a relatively simple game to teach. Nice art, nothing incredible, but very functional and pleasant, cute. Feels very much like a family weight Euro game in all of the good and bad ways. It was fine. I certainly didn't like it enough to buy it right away. Probably if I had the opportunity to show it to my family, I might do that. My daughter liked it quite a bit. I think my wife would like it. But again, I don't know that I liked it enough to go buy it. So that's Broom Service from Alexander Pfister and possibly Andreas Pelikan. Andreas somebody. I'm not sure about the particulars of his last name. Apologies again, Andreas. And then finally, last week I got in a copy of Le Havre. It's a game I've been eyeing for a long time, and I just discovered that I had enough points in my Amazon stockpile of free points to buy the game without having to pay any money for it, and it was back in print and available. So I picked up Le Havre, and I managed to get it to the table this week at Toggle Gaming. Le Havre is a classic Uwe Rosenberg game with art by Clemens Franz. Looks exactly like you would expect for a game illustrated by Clemens Franz. It was made in 2008, so it's a bit older, but really, really well loved and a really interesting game. I will say, I think I liked the game best of the 3 of us who played. The guy who won, he said, the game was fine, I'm glad I played it, but ultimately it was kind of tedious, is the way he said it. He hasn't played Agricola, so I'm not sure whether just this older style of worker placement is not his bag, or if this game particularly wasn't his bag, but I really, really enjoyed this game. So in Le Havre, you have one worker, and you are working to develop the wharf, the seaside wharf, the seaside waterfront in the French port city of Le Havre. On your turn, you have this little boat, and you move the boat forward, and it populates a couple resources into these resource bins. The resource bins slowly accumulate resources as the turns go on. And then after you've populated a couple resources, then you have the option. You can either empty one of the resource bins and take all that are available, or you can move your single worker disc to any one of the buildings in the town. This could be a building you own, it could be a building the town owns, or it could be a building one of your opponents owns. A lot of the buildings are free, but some of the buildings have entrance requirements. They have this little fee in the corner. It's usually food, but sometimes it's money, or a combination of food and money. And in order to go to that building, you have to pay that fee to whomever owns the building. So if you own it yourself, you don't have to pay the fee. If an opponent owns it, you pay them. And if the village owns it, you return it to the supply. And then you get to do whatever the building says. And a lot of the buildings are about, efficient conversion of resources. For instance, in the game we played, I ended up with a fair amount of cattle, and then I got both the tannery and the abattoir. So several times in my game, I took a big supply of cattle and I moved my worker to the abattoir. Then I turned all the cattle into meat. And for every 2 cattle that I turned into meat, I also got 1 hide from the resource supply. And then on another turn, I would take my worker to the tannery and I would turn those hides into leather. And then on another turn, I move my worker to the shipyard, and you have to spend energy to pay for your ships to go shipping as well. But then you can sell the leather overseas and you get money for the leather. And the money that I got for selling the leather ended up being the main engine that drove the economy of my game. Although in the last turn, I did manage to make some steel using someone else's steel refinery, and that took a little effort because the steel takes 5 energy to make, so I had to go out of my way to get that energy to make the steel. But then the steel sells for 8 each instead of 4. So for the 2 steel I made, I got $16 instead of $4 a piece for the leather. That is deeper than I meant to go. We played the short game and it still went 2.5 hours. So it was just 3 players. The game estimates a short game with 3 players at 2 hours and a long game with 3 players at 3 hours. I presume that's a shorter long game with people who've played a couple times. Like Agricola, the game's setup and base cards are going to be the same every game. The order they come out is going to be different each game. And each round there's a set of some number of special cards, something like 9, that become available and that come out as you're playing if you play in the long game. If you play in the short game, the special cards don't come out. But the special cards are buildings that you can build that do kind of a level of efficiency that you wouldn't otherwise have. And so they create a secondary market, or they create the replayability because they're different. So like Agricola, with the occupation cards and the minor improvement cards, the game's system is 90-95% the same every game, but that little 5% difference that comes from the minor tweaks of those cards challenge you to shift how you're choosing to be efficient, right? Every time I play, I can't go with the beef abattoir leather selling option because maybe the abattoir doesn't come out till late, or maybe there's another card that comes out that yields a much stronger resource engine, or maybe another of the other players starts taking all the beef. There's a point where I can't succeed if another player is taking all of that resource that I need. So I really liked Le Havre. I'm looking forward to playing it again. I suspect most of the time I'm going to play it solo. It's just one of those games. I also haven't played a lot of Agricola with other people. That said, I'm really glad I bought it, and I enjoy it quite a bit. So what's new in your gaming life? Pop over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let us know. And otherwise, I will talk to you later. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.